Anna, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the first installment of Newton Minds, our new series of moderated lectures with academics, business leaders, and Newton alumni who will share their international experiences with us during the series. Our first speaker is Tanweer Ali, a corporate finance expert with both industry and academic experience. His research focuses on corporate governance and applying linguistic methods to financial questions. Before entering academia, Tanweer worked for more than 10 years in different positions in the financial sector in the United Kingdom and in the Czech Republic. He has served on the board of different civil society organizations, especially in the field of human rights. Today, he is going to share his insights with us about the changing role of the corporation, both during and beyond the pandemic. We will chat about this for the first 45 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor up to your questions. Tanweer, you have the floor. Thank you for joining us.
Anna, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really glad that we could meet in the studio and talk in person. I was a little bit afraid that we would still be in a situation where we'd have to hook up via Zoom. So I'm really glad to be here. I know maybe this is frustrating for the viewers, but I have an incredibly good view of Prague as well. And the only thing is, I'm a little bit sorry that I couldn't actually speak to the audience, and I'm not actually live with the audience. That's, I guess, can't be helped. It's just a feature of the times we are in. COVID has been a great challenge for all of us as individuals. All sorts of things have happened to most of us that have been very difficult. It's been a difficult time for businesses, for all sorts of businesses, small businesses and multinational businesses with different challenges, and it's been a great challenge for governments everywhere. I think that it's also important that COVID, this whole pandemic, has also exposed problems that were there before that perhaps we hadn't seen in quite the same light. And it's also raised questions on issues that perhaps we thought were settled and a consensus had formed and apparently hasn't. After COVID, we'll have to rebuild the world. We'll try to rebuild our lives, get back to some form of normality. But I think we also have to ask, what kind of world we want to see. Do we want things to be exactly the same? And there are a whole load of challenges. The most important that come to mind straight away is climate change. But there are a whole load of challenges that are connected that we'll have to face. What I want to talk about today is the role of business in the world. And as we'll see, it's deeply connected with politics. And I think that I'm going to focus on the corporation, and the corporation is a business form which is dominant in our society, and it's certainly dominant in the global scene, in the global economy. And before I go into talking about the corporation, I want to tell you maybe a few stories. I just want to give you a few examples of maybe the way the COVID crisis has changed the way we look at businesses. So I guess we can look at the first picture. Is I don't know if people recognize this man. His name is Richard Branson. He's from the UK, and he's the founder of the Virgin brand. He's standing there behind a plane belonging to Virgin Airlines, but there's a record label and a few other things connected. There's a train company called Virgin Trains, and there's a bank. There's a Virgin Bank. So it's really the Virgin brand. Richard Branson was popular. He's projected as a likable person. I'm not sure whether he's really as likable as that image, but he came in for a lot of unpopularity during the beginning of the COVID crisis because he publicly complained to the government that the crisis is hitting his airline business, and he asked for a grant of £7 billion in order to deal with it from the point of view of a businessman trying to maximize his company's profits. That would have been a logical thing to do. But at the time when a lot of people who were perhaps already below the poverty line were facing real hardship, this was seen as cheeky coming from a billionaire. The next story, the person in the picture that you probably don't recognize is called Tim Martin. And he founded, and he's the CEO, the chief executive officer of a chain of pubs in the UK called Wetherspoons. Every town has a Wetherspoons pub, or more. And at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of the lockdown in March last year, he sent an email to all 40,000 Wetherspoon employees, basically saying, you're unlucky, you're out of a job. I can't pay you anymore. Go home and maybe you can get a job in Tesco's. I heard Tesco's are hiring. And that was more or less the email that went. Of course, that email ended up in the news. And again, he was severely criticized for behaving selfishly towards his employees, not trying to protect them, not trying to help them. Again, from a purely business perspective, most business textbooks will say, the job of the CEO is maximize the returns for shareholders. That's not a non-controversial view, as we'll see, but that's certainly a textbook view. And a lot of the response would have been, well, that's the way business works. But he was criticized. I don't know how much the pub business will suffer, but certainly people were talking about boycotting Wetherspoons when people can go back to pubs, which is actually now already from this week. So it'll be interesting to see how well the Wetherspoons chain will do. He's in this picture. Another thing about Wetherspoons, Tim Martin was a great supporter of Brexit, and that's why he's there with Boris Johnson. And previously, he complained that people, Remain voters, were boycotting his pubs. So maybe that's going to have even more of an impact now. Of course, the next picture is of the vaccines, and there are a whole group of vaccines, mostly developed by private pharmaceutical companies. And there are questions to be raised about the vaccines. I understand that, according to Bloomberg's, about 11% of the population have received 40% of the vaccine. Or countries covering 11% of the population have received 40% of the vaccines. The richest 27 countries are getting vaccinated 25 times faster than the rest of the world. And I think in Africa, there've only been 70,000 vaccines. So, how should the vaccine be delivered? Should it be just a matter of price and a commercial transaction? In the EU, we are being vaccinated a bit slower than other countries, partly because other countries just bid higher prices. Is that right? Is it something that should be just left to the market? Or should developed countries now intervene, not only to vaccinate their own populations, but to vaccinate other people? That's a question that's come up. That's an important question. My next little story is from the Czech Republic, and it's about the controversy of whether the big industrial companies, big factories, should remain open or whether they should be closed during a time of lockdown. And again, this is about the role of business, about the role of corporations, and the influence of politics on business and business on politics. And now here's a positive story, the next one. These two gentlemen are footballers or former footballers, again from the UK, and they own a chain of hotels. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when, of course, the hotels were closed, they actually decided to open their hotels up and offer free accommodation for health workers. Anyone who was, for example, working in a hospital who needed somewhere to stay between shifts, or just rather than maybe perhaps taking a long drive home after being exhausted, they offered in their hotel some sort of free service, and of course they were held up as heroes. So they interpreted their role in a slightly different way to, for example, Tim Martin of Wetherspoons or Richard Branson. The last picture, people may recognize Meryl Streep. She's in the documentary. It's an acted. It's like a document. It's really a documentary, but it's acted, and it's called Laundromat. It's all about the Panama Papers affair, which broke out a few years ago. There's a law firm called Mossack Fonseca, and someone hacked their database and leaked the tax details of millions of their clients, and a lot of those were individuals. Meryl Streep stars in the film about that. But corporate tax avoidance has become an issue, and this isn't just COVID. Like many of these things, it wasn't just a matter of COVID. It was happening before. Maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, no one really took any notice of corporate tax avoidance. Since the financial crisis in 2008, in some countries, it's become more and more of an issue. And certainly when governments were cutting budgets, people started asking questions about, how come some people are experiencing cuts to services, some people are experiencing higher taxes, and yet the big corporations are paying sometimes almost nothing. And what COVID has done has turned that into even more of an issue, because some countries, I think France and Denmark, actually said that they would not give a relief to businesses that were registered in tax havens. Mm-hmm. So that also became connected with COVID. COVID highlighted that issue, and perhaps in a way that hadn't happened before.
Mm-hmm. So as you say, the debates about the role of the corporation were already taking place, of course, before COVID, but perhaps it has made it much clearer and much starker that we need to have these debates about the role that the corporation serves. But I wonder if you can talk us through a little bit more about sort of the history of the corporation and the nature of it. How does it really function? What was it sort of set up to do and designed to do? And perhaps how attitudes towards that have been changing as well about the internal dynamics of the corporation.
Right. Okay. I guess that brings us to the next slide I had. I think the corporation has a long history. I think even, if you look even in ancient times, even in Roman law, there were possibilities to set up legal entities that were separate from individuals. Mm-hmm. In medieval times, corporation guilds formed corporations, towns formed corporations. The first corporations were probably best seen as non-profit entities. And then you had the state monopoly corporations, like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, and in Canada, the Hudson Bay Company, where basically business people bribed the king to give them a monopoly of trade. And these companies were really half-state monopolies. They were not entirely independent. And then, of course, you have the development of large corporations in America in the later part of the 19th century. What I think is important is to not think of a corporation, certainly a large corporation, in the same way as an entrepreneurial business. Mm-hmm. If I decided that academia is not for me, and I decided to set up a small business, let's say I opened a restaurant, that is my business in a way that a corporation doesn't really belong to anyone. And a corporation is so that's one thing. Certainly a large corporation is a different kind of animal. A corporation is a legal person, which means it's not the same as a human person. But it does have rights and responsibilities. Some of them overlap, with the rights and responsibilities of human people, but not entirely. I mean, a corporation doesn't have all human rights that humans have. A corporation doesn't have the right to get married, for example. But a corporation it can sue, it can get into a lawsuit, it can be sued, it can own its property, it owns its property, and it can sign contracts. And in fact, in terms of doing business, that's extremely convenient, because imagine you're working for Apple, and some of the every day the shares are traded. Each time there were a new bunch of shareholders, you'd have to sign a new employment contract with a new employer. It's much more convenient that the entity is the employer. It also means that the property of the corporation is separated from the property of any other entities, particularly the shareholders. This is limited liability. So the shareholders are not liable for the debts of the corporation. And the corporation isn't liable for the debts of the shareholders. That goes both ways. And the corporation is judged in many jurisdictions, certainly the Anglo-Saxon jurisdictions. The directors of a corporation actually have quite a lot of independence in how they run it. The business judgment rule means that judges, they will get involved if they see deliberate personal conflicts of interest of senior managers and directors, but not. They will try to not get involved in management, and they'll trust that the directors will run the business as best they can, and not let them be sued for making bad business decisions, for getting into conflicts of interest, for corruption, yes, but not in terms of business decisions. So managers actually have quite a lot of leeway. And a corporation has a lot of contributors. There are parties that put in money, like, for example, the investors, banks, bondholders, also suppliers sometimes, shareholders, customers, communities, employees. There's a whole group of stakeholders in the corporation.
Mm-hmm. This is really interesting, and I suppose it goes to the core question of who a corporation is for, right?
Right.
There was a 2018 book published by Yale University Press, a Boston law professor, Ken Greenfield, and the book is titled "Corporations Are People Too, and They Should Act Like It," right? And I found this idea really interesting, that we should bestow similar rights onto corporations as we do to citizens. But of course, as you were saying, you can't bestow all kinds of rights. Right. Corporations can't get married. But he argues that there are certain rights that should help corporations sort of achieve their aims, that we should bestow on them, privacy rights included. But he also sort of flips the argument, and these rights are meant to be there to help corporations achieve their aims, such as wealth creation. But that should be wealth creation that benefits society at large. And as you mentioned, there are so many different stakeholders, but Greenfield argues, for example, that even employees and the local communities in which the corporation operates should be considered as stakeholders as well, and goes as far to argue that they should also be involved in sort of the democratic decisions within corporate governance. I wonder, is that something that there's been a lot of debate on as well? And what would you say on that, the sort of these proposals to democratize corporate governance?
I think that, first of all, I'm not familiar with the book. I haven't read the book, but I'm familiar with other work by Ken Greenfield. I think the background is the Citizens United judgment in the United States, where in 2010, the US Supreme Court awarded corporations human rights, particularly in terms of political funding. Right. It gave corporations the human right of political engagement, which is complicated because a corporation can be a very rich person in that sense, and whether corporations should get involved in politics, and how to interpret and apply those rights is complex legally. I don't think there is a simple answer. I'd be surprised if Ken Greenfield is suggesting a simple answer, because I know he's quite a sophisticated scholar. I think it's complicated. There are some rights that would apply to corporations, some that wouldn't. Certainly, the right of due process in law would clearly apply to a corporation. I'm not sure whether corporations it makes sense to talk about voting rights for corporations. So that I don't think the rights of citizenship apply to corporations. I think that's not I know people talk about corporate citizenship, but I don't think the actual political rights of citizens would necessarily or should apply to corporations. In terms of democratizing corporations, there is a big debate. I think there are different ways of doing it. There have been proposals coming from different places to democratize the corporations. For example, back to the UK, Theresa May, who was a Conservative Prime Minister, suggested bringing workers on the board, having a law saying that workers should have representation on corporate boards. So it's not necessarily a proposal coming from the left. In Germany, that's a normal practice. I suspect that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model. I suspect there are different ways of doing it that will work for different kinds of organisation and different kinds of different jurisdictions.
And I suppose this goes back to the idea of corporations not operating in a vacuum, right?
Right.
Of course, as you talked about in the introduction, the COVID pandemic has really affected how we think about them, sort of how we debate them, and perhaps this debate is going to stay for us in the long term. Well, we've been talking about examples from the US and from the UK, of course, but corporations operate internationally and perhaps in developing countries. The debate is even more important, sort of how they interact politically with the societies in which they operate, right? Should they have a responsibility to solve some of the more, or even at least engage with some of the more pressing problems that developing countries face?
I think that I would say that corporations, the principle that they should take is not to do wrong. I don't think it's reasonable to expect corporations to do more than that. Although to not do wrong is actually quite a big ask as well. So in the developing world, corporations are acting in an environment where institutions aren't necessarily strong. In fact, that's probably what makes it the developing world. And therefore, the corporations have an opportunity to exploit that. And institutions. I'm thinking more in terms of the way that the philosopher John Rawls, characterized development. And I think that if he has this concept of minimally just institutions, and a well-ordered society is one where there are functioning minimally just institutions that give its citizens some minimal justice, recourse to law, protection from the worst kinds of abuses. And corporations shouldn't certainly not exploit that lack to make a profit and actually exploit people, perhaps in some cases actively be involved in human rights abuses or harm the environment because the institutions to control that don't exist. I also think that corporations should promote the development of institutions, and it need not. This idea of them being minimally just means that it doesn't necessarily mean that corporations should impose values on societies.
Right.
That's how I would see the responsibilities of corporations in developing countries.
And so there's this idea that we've come across as well of the corporation as a knowledge organization. Does that come into this debate?
I think it does. A lot of research, I was going to say recent research, but I think some of it's not that recent, concludes that actually the individual human being doesn't know very much.
Right.
Even the memory capacity of the human brain is not that much compared to what you can. It's like maybe a terabyte. I'm not even a terabyte, maybe a gigabyte or something like that. I don't remember the number, but it's the amount of knowledge that the individual brain can hold is not that much. It may be surprisingly little. Mm-hmm. And there's even experts in a field end up knowing surprisingly little. The important thing about knowledge is that it's a group activity. It's teams of people that develop things. We and corporations play a role in that process in terms of not only of institutionalizing knowledge. So corporations are organizations that develop knowledge and keep knowledge beyond just being a group of people doing something.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose it also touches on this idea we discussed before, sort of the changes to corporate governance, the historical development and how it should be organized. But knowledge also comes into this sort of in more detail, right? This kind of idea of who decides, who really makes the decisions. Do shareholders even have access to enough information to make the kinds of decisions, or is it the CEO and the management that is making the decisions? Because if the corporation is set up to represent shareholders, how does this work in terms of sort of knowledge exchange and who actually has access to the required information?
The shareholders certainly, for a large public corporation, certainly don't have the information. They can get a lot of information, but they won't have the information of the managers. They won't have the time to get involved. And they don't necessarily have the motive to get involved. You can sell shares in a corporation over the space of a few seconds. Right. I don't know how long it takes to sell a share in terms of seconds. So certainly there are organizations that trade, there are businesses that trade within nanoseconds. This high-speed trading, high-frequency trading. So they are clearly not vested in a corporation in the same way as an employee is.
Right.
They haven't invested, and the knowledge thing is important because an employee, some of an employee's knowledge is applicable elsewhere. So some of the things that every person knows are specific to a field of activity or a profession, but some of that knowledge is specific to that business. It's networks. It's how things fit together, certain processes, and that person has therefore made an investment in that company, which they would lose if they left. And it's very common that people leave a job and then end up with something possibly lower paid, just because some of their value they were contributing as an employee is firm specific. In that sense, they've made an investment.
Right. And as we see, of course, as you just said, corporations with so many shareholders that they don't really have sort of the time or the knowledge or the access to sort of get involved in the decision-making process. And we also talked about, for example, Ken Greenfield's idea about sort of democratic governments within the corporation. You said in Germany already workers to a certain extent sort of have these powers. I mean, what would be your suggestions, I suppose? Or do you have some sort of insights to share with us within these debates, perhaps where we should be moving forward about corporate governance?
I think that, as I said, I don't think that the right way to go is to have one model that fits everywhere. Right. I would certainly look at the German model of workers on the board. I think that cooperatives are a business model that perhaps deserve more support or more prominence, because they are very interesting, because they are worker governed. Worker cooperatives are worker governed, but they function in a competitive economy.
Right.
So you have private business, but it's controlled in a different way, and there is some evidence that they are actually more effective in terms of actually competing in a market environment. They're quite common they're quite widespread in the United States. Interestingly, they have these types of businesses called ESOPs, which are basically cooperatives in that.
Right. And when we talked before about this debate in the United States about corporations having rights, personhood, or even citizenship, does that apply to these cooperatives as well? Then would they be treated within the same legal framework?
They would have that legal entity status as well, except that the capital is owned by the. I said capital, not the business, is owned by the either consumers or employees. They're different types of cooperatives. I think the cooperative model. I'm not sure whether it should be the dominant model necessarily, but I think it's a model that is worth looking at promoting.
Right. Because on the flip side, of course, we have the model of the corporation where the CEO or the management really are calling the shots, right? Because the shareholders, as we said, don't necessarily have the access to information or to just, the day-to-day running of the firm, of course. And I'm sort of interested in how you view the political role of the corporation. Perhaps in the example of the cooperative, there's more, democratic level decision making, right? So they can take a political stance that sort of, the whole firm has voted for.
Right.
But just yesterday, The Economist came with a headline about the sort of increasing political vocalness of CEOs in the United States. And these are then people who are often calling the shots themselves and making the decision to, vocally support, say, the Black Lives Matter movement or the Me Too campaign, sort of publicly, without necessarily discussing it with shareholders or with anyone else in the corporation. And the article in The Economist actually came to the conclusion that this is purely pontificating, that there haven't really been any sort of material, practical changes within these kinds of, Coca-Cola and other sort of international corporations that we all know, apart from just these, vocal political statements. I guess what would you say on this? And is there a way for those types of massive multinational corporations to also sort of take a role in politics that perhaps isn't just seen as pontificating?
Okay, I actually think that they shouldn't.
Right.
I think that there's a difference between respecting, taking care of the environment and not doing damage, respecting human rights, and getting involved in politics. And I've asked students sometimes, what do you think of Nike getting involved with Copernic, with the advertisements and Black Lives Matter, and they say, well, that's good. It makes me more likely to buy their product. And I say, well, that's fine, but what if Nike was getting involved in something something that you don't like? What if how would you feel about that? I think that I think that corporations have to be careful. I really think that if they focus on not doing harm, making sure that there are no abuses in their supply chain, it's a little bit difficult to hear a corporate CEO talking about something like that, and also knowing that there is exploitation going on in their supply chain. And the firm is doing absolutely everything it can to avoid paying tax, which is money that would be used to actually improve the lives of people. So I think that, and then of course corporations getting involved in politics can end up. I mean, there's I don't think corporations should be so actively involved in lobbying as they are. I think they need to keep out of that. I don't agree with a lot of what Milton Friedman said. At one point, he says the business of business is business. What he meant was that businesses shouldn't be involved in social responsibility. I don't agree with that.
Right.
But I do think that they should look after their business before getting involved in politics. One other little comment I make: there is a field, there is a strand of opinion called political CSR, called political corporate social responsibility, which says corporations should fill the role of government. I don't agree with that. I think there are some fields of activity that should be done by people who are elected to do that, and probably more qualified to do that, and accountable. On a personal level, I think it's great that Bill Gates is interested and involved in public health. I'm not sure that he's the best qualified individual to look at public health. I think it would be, and I'm not necessarily making a dig at him personally, but I think it would be better if people like that, or corporations, paid their tax and allowed states to democratically, in a democratically accountable way, to run those processes.
And I suppose from the examples that we talked about at the beginning, with to do with COVID, to do with Wetherspoons, the email becoming public towards employees, do you get a sense that that we can say that corporations shouldn't get so involved in politics, especially when it just is seen as statements without any sort of practical changes? But do you get a sense that they're doing more of it now? I mean, is that becoming not only a popular but a sort of an effective PR strategy?
I believe it probably is effective simply because that's why they're doing it. I think it's. I mean, I can't say I disagree with their support of the Black Lives Matter movement or Me Too, but I think that it's not going to be instrumental in making change. I think it's a little bit late, and I think that a lot of the underlying problems involving economic inequality will be solved by reforming the way corporations are governed.
So how would you say?
I think one of the things that has happened in the last 30, 40 years is that the incomes of in most developed countries, the incomes of a very small minority of people have increased at a much faster pace than the incomes of everyone else. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the way corporations are run. The current focus, because there's the debate on the role of the corporation actually has a long history over the 20th century. And from the 80s onwards, the focus shifted towards shareholders and the idea of shareholder value, the idea that really the corporation exists for the shareholders, who are as Milton Friedman would say, the owners of the business. As I said, I think that's confusing the entrepreneurial business with the large corporation. And I think that focus on shareholders has enabled the people like senior managers, financiers, hedge fund managers, some investors, to actually capture some of that value, some of those profits. I don't think it's necessarily involved benefits to shareholders as a collective group, but it certainly enabled a focus, a refocus of what a corporation's for, and I think that that is harm that will have harmed minorities. That's harm that's done more harm than any verbal support for the Black Lives Matter movement would do.
Right, of course. And it just goes back to sort of all of the questions we discussed, right? Sort of going back to the future then, I mean, do you see, we've talked about COVID affecting corporations and affecting public support for them, or the way people interact with them. Perhaps they have higher expectations of CEOs or management sort of taking a stance. I mean, I guess, do you see a long-term change in that, sort of more citizen pressure on businesses and corporations to be more socially responsible?
I think so. I think it'll be slower. When we say corporate governance, it's not really something that people talk about at home, in the pub, over dinner. It's not a hot topic. But I think there's an awareness of corporations, of the assets involved, of the investment involved. The question of who it should be for, who should benefit, who owns it, is, I think, a question that is going to become an important one.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose, do you have any sort of summary statement about sort of what we talked about today, or anything else that we didn't sort of touch on that you prepared that you wanted to talk with us today about?
What I would say is that the activities of corporations are underemphasized. We talk about all sorts of political issues when we talk about politics, when we talk about some of the issues that we face. We talk about climate change, we talk about human development, we talk about human rights. We underplay the importance of corporations in our lives. Mm-hmm. A lot of what we consume, maybe most of what we consume, most of how we're provided for is done by corporations. If not most people, a lot of people who work in the private sector, a large proportion of the population work for corporations. That means that they dominate a large part of our lives. They're certainly dominant in the political field. But they're not talked about that much. And even business degrees, business curricula don't really focus on the corporation as an entity. And I think that it's, on the other hand, I don't want that to sound negative. I mean, the corporate form as an organizational form has been able to get us to the level of prosperity that we have. Mm-hmm. But we do need to take another look at who they are for, how they are run. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an important question because we know that the alternative to a market economy doesn't work. And the question is how do we make this economy work for us? Mm-hmm.
And how we set up that interaction between corporations and politics, what sort of rights we give them, etc., how we sort of regulate them.
Yeah.
Of course. Well, we can open up the floor to questions. If you have any, and you've been following us during this informal lecture, please submit them, and we will read them out here. I suppose I also had a question about, sort of for our students as well. Okay, but I see that, there are some questions, but I will just ask you this question that I had also, so for our students watching, I know this has been quite, both sort of theoretical, but also quite general in terms of, corporate governance and corporate responsibility. Do you have any suggestions for someone, who's coming to this topic perhaps relatively new, studying business and management, thinking about corporate finance, where they should go to sort of perhaps start reading about this or some topical resources, sort of where they can start to really grapple with the topic? Because as you said, when we say corporate governance, it sounds quite broad. Perhaps people don't know what to imagine under this, but also sounds quite perhaps difficult to grapple with. Right. But then the examples that we talked about are real life examples. And as you said, most of what we buy is produced by corporations. So what would you recommend to someone perhaps, how to get introduced to this topic more academically?
It's a tough one because a lot of what's written about it is not really aimed at a larger audience. For a business student, there's a book called The Shareholder Value Myth. It's written by someone called Lynn Stout, who was a Harvard law professor. Mm-hmm. I think that's quite a good introduction to the debate. Mm-hmm. Whichever view you come to in the end. Certainly for the alternative perspective, although I don't agree with them, I think that Milton Friedman would be a good person to look at. He wrote a really famous article in 1970 he says that the only social responsibility of business is to make as much profit as it can.
Right.
That's a good place to look just to see how that debate was going. Mm-hmm. The Business Roundtable is an organization. It's basically an organization of American CEOs and they publish material on corporate governance. Interestingly, and it's on one of those slides, but that's the one. In 1981, they published this report saying, basically a business is part of society. Business, politics, and social issues and business planning are all, They quoted, the person is Reginald Jones, who was CEO of General Electric, so one of the most important CEOs in the world. And the focused responsibility. You see, 1997, that they've switched. The paramount duty is to the corporation's shareholders. The interests of other stakeholders are relevant, but as a derivative of, in other words, you want to take care of your employees because that's good for the shareholders in the long run. Take care of your suppliers and your customers because it's good for the shareholders. But ultimately it's the shareholders. A couple of years ago, they actually have turned around, and now maybe that's the next slide after that. No, after that. Yeah. You see that the 2019 statement of the Business Roundtable says, each of our individual companies serves its own corporate purpose. We have a fundamental commitment to all of our stakeholders. So they've changed. They criticised for that because the criticism is that this is just hot air. But I think it's important because that commitment on paper will, I believe, turn into more of a change.
Right. So they made this statement, but they haven't necessarily worked out what that would actually mean to involve all the stakeholders.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's certainly indicative of where the wind's blowing.
Right.
But for a student, I would certainly look at their website and see what they say about corporate governance.
Right. And then we can follow those debates, but also some new developments in terms of the practicalities of involving all of those different stakeholders. Right. And of course, we can share the presentation afterwards as well with our students and all of our viewers. And you can post more comments as well about this. So Sorry,
just one other thing that came to my mind. There's an organisation called Frank Bold, and they got a grant and they did a Europe-wide project on the purpose of the corporation. It's ongoing, but they have a report called The Purpose of the Corporation. They're actually a Czech organisation, and although it was a Europe-wide project, they initiated it. It's Frank Bold. And if you Google them and look for their work on the purpose of the corporation, that would be a good place to look as well.
Okay, thank you. We can post all of that in the comments as well for people who are interested. So let me just read out some of the questions that are coming in. Milan is asking us about corporate social responsibility, as you talked about. Isn't it just a form of indulgence to keep a distance between state and its power?
I think with corporate social responsibility, I think it is complicated because I think that there are people in corporations, there are human beings in corporations who want to do the right thing or what they feel is the right thing. I think that there are people who just see it as marketing, but it's not really something that there's a commitment to. Ultimately, what I think is that it's not the answer without some form of accountability.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Okay, one more question from Rob. How do you feel about the recent trends towards social responsibility regarding public procurement? And he's got another question, actually, that's a follow-up. On top of being green and ethical, which is great for marketing, many investors now only want to invest in ethical, moral companies, and even more consumers who want to buy from such companies. So I guess, how does that work in your view?
Again, I think if you were talking about public procurement, I think what's important there is accountability and information. And enforcement of laws and making sure that if they're breached, something happens. I think the trend in investment, it's called ESG, environmental, social, and governance. the trend to use that as a criterion of investment is growing rapidly and has been for a long time. I think it's right, but I think it's also good business sense, because I think if a company is doing harm, that raises a question about its long-term sustainability. A company that's doing something that's harming the environment will probably face regulations at some time in the next few years. And then investment. I mean, I think the oil industry and its other fossil fuels, that's an example. There's a risk that if a company in that business that's not able to look at how to transition and just trying to just carry on doing what it's doing, you will end up being forced to change, and that may not be a very profitable thing for it. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing is that if you have managers that are prepared to mistreat other stakeholders, what makes you as a shareholder think that you're going to be treated any better? Mm-hmm. I think that's, you're more likely to find with a company that's cutting corners in everywhere else that, one day there was a huge fraud and they're bankrupt, and as an investor you've lost everything.
Right. So they don't necessarily even need the ethical or moral reasoning. It's just from pure sort of, in the long run, it's better for the corporation.
I think it's better for the corporations. I think it's better for the investors. But I think people are becoming more and more aware of the connections between what they're buying and where they're investing and the world they live in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We've got one more question from Karina. What role will cooperation play in the post-COVID period in the context of the gradual recovery of the economic sector? And which sectors would you say are likely to recover the fast and which the slowest? And I suppose, again, what role the corporations plays in this?
I think the corporations will carry on playing a very important role. They've played an important role. The Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened without corporations, without that form of organization. And it's connected with what we were talking about knowledge. They're a repository and a way that knowledge is developed in society. It's not the only place, of course. Universities are, and other organizations, but they're an important way in which business is organized. I think they'll carry on being important. The other question, which sectors will recover faster? I'm afraid I'm not really in the business of making economic predictions. I'd rather not. I think no one would really honestly can say that they know. I think we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we don't have any more questions. Do pop us any more if you think of them, but also pop them in the comments. As I said, we can still answer them, and we will post Tanweer's recommendations about the readings if you're interested as well. So thank you for everyone who was watching us today, for joining us. As Tanweer said, we're sad that you couldn't be with us today in person, but at least we hope we could share this with you in an interactive way. And we really hope that you're going to join us again in 2 weeks when our next speaker, who's a Newton alumnus, Tomáš Tichý, who is now also studying and working in Taiwan, and he's going to talk to us about his academic trajectory and his experiences as they have been affected by the pandemic as well. And especially if you are thinking about Taiwan as a potential destination for your exchange studies, if you're thinking about this, please tune in on the 29th of April and join us. Thank you.